of Chapter Business. Just wanted to, first of all, thank you for making this webinar and for attending this digital encounter that we have here. As you know, we're trying to improve your membership experience, and we seem to be doing very well today. As of today, we are 270 members strong in the community, and that includes also people not only in Orlando, Florida, but across the nation. So thank you, everyone. And thanks. Hello there. Hi, Hans. Hi, Becky. Hi, everyone coming in. And one thing also I wanted to share with you was that we keep going. There's not, we got other things going. I'm showing you our website. Obviously, as you're very familiar with our website at this point, you should be. But we want to take time to thank our power members, which are those folks that have the ATD national membership and also the local membership with us. And we have this event today, obviously, which is Effective Learning Objectives, and we get to talk to none other than the author of the revision of Bloom's Taxonomy. So if you have heard about Bloom's Taxonomy and how it should be applied, well, there's a lot of misconceptions out there in the world, and that's where we're here today to kind of enjoy some good clarifications and what is really what it was meant to be. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and launch a quick poll here and allow you to interact. Just make sure we'll give you a few minutes here to vote and submit your response to that, to the poll question. In the meantime, as you do that, I would like to bring out to you that we have other events coming up. And if you look here, we have personalization tips for onboarding with Carol Cohen. That's happening next week. I know the digital encounter. And then September, September 26th, we have a power member event. That is a local event, face-to-face. If you happen to be in town, come over and check us out. And if you live here, obviously, more than welcome to come in. It will be a social networking event that it's exclusive for power members, and you can attend at a small fee if you're not a power member. If by any chance, by the way, if by any chance you are a power member and we have not designated you as one, that could be a glitch in systems and whatnot, let us know. Just send us your membership ID number from ATD at communications@atdcfl.org. And I'll put that on the chat here so everyone can see, but it's our main communications email, communications@atdcfl.org. And feel free, if you're a power member and when you go to register for that event, it's not free for you. It may be because you're not designated in our system yet as a power member. So that can happen. We can fix that quickly. Just send us your ID number there. Alrighty, guys. So let's see, we got some responses going already. We got about 4 responses. I know we got more people than 4 or 5. There we go. So we can get into that. So you're still viewing the questions. Please give us your response here. We'll give you about another minute, and we'll go from there. It's anonymous, so don't worry. Nobody's going to call you out on it. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, I'll open that up here after we do the introduction. It looks like so far we got a split on the different things that Bloom's Taxonomy was built for. We'll see that. And let me go ahead and stop the share. Okay. Alrighty. So it's a very special time, actually, unless everybody please send your prayers and wishes of wellness to Dr. Anderson, because he is in the path of Dorian at this point. He just informed me that the storm is coming out to South Carolina. That's where he lives. So we wish you the best, Dr. Lorin. So great. So let me go ahead and end the polling there. See we've got enough responses. Good. So the responses that we had are very interesting. We'll discuss those there. Let's go ahead and I'll share the results here after the introduction. But anyway, as you probably know, you're here for this digital encounter in which we are going to learn about learning objectives, Bloom's taxonomy, and the relationship between Bloom's taxonomy and writing effective learning objectives. This is more of a Q&A format, and will allow you to ask your questions as we go along. So in this event, obviously, we're relying on the expertise and, one of the key, the author of the revision of Bloom's taxonomy back in 2001, 2002. And, I had the pleasure to do a two-part episode in our vlog, in the Off the Cuff vlog. And this gentleman is Professor Emeritus of the University of South Carolina. And many other accolades, of course, besides being the author of the revision. And it's my pleasure to introduce you guys to Dr. Lorin Anderson. Hi, Lorin.
Hey, Alex.
So we have, I'm going to go ahead and share the results of the poll here. And let's see. So we had the question as to what's the purpose of Bloom's taxonomy in relation to learning objectives. We had about 6 respondents. 50% of those folks said that it's a development theory. The other options were as a writing guide and as a validation tool. Would you care to explain to us what is the original purpose of Bloom's taxonomy and how did it change in your revision?
Okay. There's one wrong answer and 2 halfway right answers in the poll.
Okay.
Historically speaking, it was never intended as a writing tool. So that's the wrong answer. Basically, what it was an attempt to take objectives that were written by faculty members in institutions of higher education and find a way of classifying them into categories so that the job of writing test items would be easier. And the test items could be shared across institutions. This was developed after World War II. And at that time, a lot of people were coming to universities funded by the GI Bill. And so the notion of trying to find ways of giving credit to situations where the numbers of students really outnumbered the number of faculty became a difficult situation for many of these people that were working in universities. And so what they decided to do was to do kind of a credit by examination approach, which pretty much meant that they had to come up with very good instruments. So they would get the objectives from the instructors of the courses, then they would write items, then they discussed the items, and because it was credit by examination, these tended to be fairly long, 100 items, 200 item multiple choice tests. And then it would, if you passed it, you got your credit. You could, however you learned was up to you as a student. If you wanted to meet with other people, if you wanted to do peer groups, if you wanted to listen to lectures, if you wanted to read books or whatever, that was fine. But the ultimate goal was to pass the exam. And so the development of the exam, the administration of the exam, the scoring of the exam, and the reporting of the exams were what we now call high stakes tests. That either you passed or you failed. And if you passed, you got credit. And if you failed, you didn't get credit. But you could take it again at a later date.
Okay. And how did it change when you wrote the revision? Did it change at all, or is still?
Well, the focus changed because with the original taxonomy, the emphasis was really on test item writing. Nobody sat down and said, these are the good objectives, these are bad objectives. It's simply whatever objectives you have, we'll find a way of developing a strategy for writing good items, valid items, reliable items for those objectives. When we wrote the revision, we started to talk about what makes good objectives, how are objectives linked with instruction, how are objectives aligned with assessments, and all three, the big three, you have the objectives, the assessments, and the instruction, all should be interrelated. And that was really the major purpose of revising it.
Okay, that's good. That makes sense. So I'd like to, at this point, open it up for everyone in audience, because, again, this is a Q&A format, guys. And if you would use the chat and ask your questions, any questions you would like to ask Dr. Anderson, please let us know through the chat. This is your time to shine on that. And I'll be tracking, keeping my eyes as fast as possible. So let's see some questions coming through if you guys can do. And I'll give you a few seconds here to give you about 10 seconds to see a question, and otherwise we'll get going. We got other questions that some folks asked us on social media, and those are some interesting questions that we'll also bring up. Right, not seeing any questions come through yet. Good. So let me ask you this question then, Lorin. One person asked on social media, one of the bigger questions that were asked were about the overlapping of action verbs. So as you know, a lot of people, there's many universities that put out these guides of specific action verbs. And one of the main thing is that, well, before I get into that, here's a good question from Hans. What is the correct answer in terms of the poll for Bloom's taxonomy? So you said that two of the answers are sort of half correct.
Right.
Now, I guess if we look at 1956 is exactly just a validation tool, right?
That's right.
That's right. If we look at 2001, then it's more of a writing guide as well.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's changed in that regard, but the answer for the original taxonomy is choice 2.
Okay, and that's a good point to bring, because many folks in the industry, they're still citing 1956, even though they don't know about it. So I guess it's because, as we discussed before in the video, not a lot of people know that there was a revision in 2001, and that changes completely the learning levels and you switch from being verb based, as remembering and things like that. And so that appeal more to also the learning process in a way, right? Where you can look at it not just in the sense of writing test items. Good question there, Hans. So what you're saying, okay, so Hans tells us also that that's what's been taught in higher educational institutions. So I guess what you mean, Hans, is that it's being taught in higher education institutions that Bloom's taxonomy is a writing guide, even though the 1956 version as well as that. I can see that, and that's part of the conversation we had with Lorin and on the YouTube episode. So yeah, validation tool, correct. So, okay, as a validation tool, awesome. So relating back to the question that we were asking you about the action verbs, so a lot of people will, tend to say, look at, go online and find this guides, this matrices, if you will, of action verbs and where they on the addressing specific learning level. One question that was asked is that, what happens with there seems to be an overlap in certain verbs, such as identify. So in other words, could you identify it at the remembering level and also identify it at the creation level?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's a difference between the cognitive process and the behavior.
Okay.
All right. That identify is not a cognitive process per se.
Okay.
Remember is a cognitive process, but identify is almost the behavior that you have, and you can identify any of those cognitive processes. You can identify how it applies to certain circumstances. You can identify the criteria used to evaluate a particular product. Okay. So one of the first things you have to do is eliminate those verbs that are clearly indications of behavior, but have no bearing in terms of relationship to cognitive processes. And we got rid of a lot of those. For example, state. Students will state. Okay, state is like identify. What are you stating? Are you what process is producing the state? Right. Okay, and that's, if you go back to this 60s when these objectives became really generally agreed upon as that we're going to have objectives, you saw a lot of those behavioral terms. And what we're trying to do when we revised it was to say, no, you're thinking about cognitive processes. So we always keep going with cognitive processes. We don't talk about processes per se, because if you use the term processes, behaviors are processes, thoughts are processes, emotions are processes.
Okay. And
what we have attempted to do is to categorize cognitive processes. And we try to do it in a way where overlaps are kind of mentioned. And I'll give you the perfect example that we've struggled with, and that is compare. Students will compare. Now, that's a cognitive process. It involves looking at similarities. It involves looking at differences, talking about how something's similar to something and different from something. Now, what's interesting here is people say, and this is a good teacher-ish kind of a talk, they'll use the phrase compare and contrast.
Right.
Well, that's an interesting combination, because compare means look at similarities and differences. Contrast means look at differences. And so compare and contrast means look at similarities and differences, and then differences again. Okay, that's redundant. The differences again. That if you understand that compare means to look at similarities and differences, you don't need contrast in there. And the table that you're showing right here, this is very typical, that people will put all these different kinds of things in there. And it's almost like they went through a verb handbook and kind of found every verb they could and then stuck it somewhere within the table.
I see. Yeah, and you can see, for example, you can see compare here at the understanding level, and we have compare also at the evaluation level.
That's right. That's right.
So the context there is...
And you have compare at the analyze level. The issue is that compare can go any of these places, but its primary responsibility, if you ask students to compare, you are looking for basic understanding. You can ask them to compare from an evaluative point of view. You can say, which of these is better? Which of these is more efficient? Which of these costs less? Okay, that's a compare, but that's a behavior. That's not a cognitive process. The cognitive process there is evaluate.
I see.
So again, it's not easy, because you have these things that serve multiple purposes, and it's the same thing. When you put a verb in an objective, that's your intended outcome. That's what an objective is, intended outcome. You can't guarantee that that's what the students are going to learn. That you can't guarantee that that's what the students are going to use.
Correct.
What you can say is a bunch of us got together and we think that we intend students to learn these things.
Very good point. Very good point. Yes, because I mean, you can't really, guarantee it. You could, I guess, have some measuring tools afterwards, right? Some evaluation sort of metrics, but that still will have to, won't be able to guarantee that the outcome, as you mentioned, the intended outcome.
That's right. And if you want to know where compare, for example, would fit, it's almost important to look at how you would assess students' ability to compare. Okay, so that if what they're comparing, and this is where the object of the objective comes in, if what they're comparing is the cost effectiveness of different approaches to solving a mechanical problem, okay, that's evaluate.
I see.
Okay. On the other hand, if they're comparing adverbs and adjectives, that's understand. So you can't just classify an objective based.
So we have another.
Based on the verb.
Okay, based on the verb. Good. So we have a question here from Daniel Keegan. Hi, Daniel. So he asks, does cognitive process equal measurable results? Measurable, can't even say measurable today. So understanding as a level is not necessarily measurable. I don't know if I sort of agree with that. But what is your take on that? So he's saying the understanding as a level is not necessarily measurable. And so he would like to know at what point he can determine measurables, something that's measurable.
Well,
I guess the cognitive processes are easier, I guess is what he's asking.
Yeah. I mean, some are easier to measure, some are more difficult to measure, and so forth. But again, remember that what we're trying to do here is classify objectives, and so you may have an objective that you say, that's still our objective, we're just not going to be able to collect data. Okay. But that doesn't mean that's not important. It doesn't mean it's something we should work toward. You kind of have to do a wing and a prayer on that. But understand is an interesting example, because the way we dealt with it, if you look at our book, okay, or if you look, there's a theory into practice special issue in 2001 that has the way we classify everything. And the way we figured out what the subparts of understand was, because we agreed that understand was too vague to be measured. So we brought in a group of teachers and we asked them a very simple question. How do you know when your student understands something? Okay? That is, in fact, the assessment question. How do you know that the kid understands something? And so here's the kind of answers we got. We think that our students understand if they can give a new example of what we're teaching. See, if it's an old example, it's just remember. But if they can come up with a new example, that's fine. We think that students understand if they can take a body of information and write a 25-word summary. Okay, that tells us that is that. First, we did, okay, that's called exemplify. Okay, that if students can exemplify, they understand. The second one we call summarize. If students can summarize, they understand. If students can explain to you what you were teaching to them and see the cause-effect relationships, they understand. Okay. So within our category of understand, there are 7 subcategories. Each of those subcategories were derived from interviews that we've conducted with the teachers that said, basically, how do you know? That to me is the fundamental assessment question. And you can ask that same question for every one of our categories. How do you know that that a student's creating something instead of just copying something that they picked up somewhere along the way? Okay. What has to be there to be creative? Okay. All of these things are that's our list right there. Right. Okay. So if you look at understand, you have interpreting. If students can interpret, that means say it in their own words, right? If they can exemplify, give examples. If they can take things and put them in the same category that we're talking about, summarize, infer, which is basically predict, compare, and explain. Those are the 7 subcategories of understand. The definition is above it. Determine the meaning of instructional messages, including oral, written, and graphic communication.
Okay, awesome. So we got another question here from Daniel as well. So what are interrogative pronouns representing verbs under remember? Daniel, can you clarify where do you see that, or was that in one of these, or What are interrogative pronouns representing verbs? Okay. Oh, like which, who, why. Okay. On the remember.
Yeah, I wouldn't put those there. If you go back to the one you just showed, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that one. Okay. As a cognitive process, there are two subcategories, as you see here. One is recognizing and one is recalling.
Right.
Now, how do you know that those are, and those are the only two we have. We don't have the who, what, where, when, why, and so forth and so on. See, that comes out of this notion that the whole purpose of the revised taxonomy is writing items. Okay, you can write who items, where items, and so forth and so on. But in terms of the cognitive process, there's recognize and recall. Now, how do you know that those are different? Well, here's the example. You're at a party, with a large group of people, and all of a sudden you look across the room and you see somebody walking toward you, and automatically you go, I recognize that person, but I can't recall the name. Every one of us has had that experience.
Right.
Now, if that didn't happen, you wouldn't need recognize and recall. Okay? You would just say, I recognize and recall are the same thing, but it isn't. I can recognize and not recall something. I can recall something and not put my finger on an example of what it looks like. All of these things are possible. And every one of our subgroups or sub processes here are different. And we think that this set is basically all you need. And I remember after we first published it, somebody basically sent me a list very much like what you showed in the other page.
Right.
And that one, and they said, oh, I wanted to show you how much work I've done on this and how much I've tried to help you by providing all these other things. And I said, well, thank you for all your effort, but I think it confuses more than helps.
Right. And that's
you got too many things here, whereas if you just focus on the 17 that we have, you're going to be a lot clearer in what you're trying to do.
Yes. So basically the message here for everyone that's watching is go online, just search for his name, Anderson 2001 PDF, and you'll have a free version that you can grab from anywhere that has at least some of those listings and stuff like that. Obviously, you get more benefit out of having the book, but in more detail, more in depth. But what I wanted to bring this up, and the reason why I brought this up is because in today's world, anybody that's doing instructional design on corporate level, it's basically just told either whether they went to an education program or they just meet others in their team. You'll hear the use of Bloom's taxonomy, and then the first thing that people will do maybe a Google search, and they'll end up in a table like this. And so we'll have those issues that you are mentioning. There is a good question here from Rachel or Raquel. Sorry, I want to make sure I've pronounced it right. But how is the relationship between Bloom's taxonomy and corporate instructional design? And she mentions that there are a lot of L&D professionals who are more in favor of performance outcomes and learning than learning objectives. And so, this brings back to memories of the conversation that we had regarding in the video regarding performance objectives versus learning objectives. And obviously we discussed the different knowledges, which we're going to probably get into here. But in that question that she asked, where do you see the relationship of being able to use Bloom's taxonomy for, let's say, corporate instructional design?
Well, I think first of all, I think they're complementary. I wouldn't necessarily see that you'd have to choose one or the other. Okay. Because there are certain things that lend themselves more there's a difference between performance that allows you to make inferences about learning, cognitive learning, and performances that are important in and of themselves. Okay, so if you're teaching how to use a lathe, okay, the performance objective is use the lathe without killing yourself.
Right.
Okay, and that's perfectly legitimate. But if you only have that without the cognitive, then what happens is that when things don't go right, you're stuck.
Right.
If you've thought things through, if you considered consequences, if you have a basic understanding of what's going on, okay, then you can modify the performances. So if you're playing tennis, for example, there are a lot of performance objectives in tennis, but when you put a person into a match situation, there's a lot of cognitive decision-making that goes along. There are a lot of people who can hit the ball with topspin as hard as you possibly can that are not good tennis players. Okay, they've mastered hitting with topspin as hard as you can, but they have no strategies. They don't know when to rush the net, when to stay back, when to lob, okay, when to volley. Okay, these are all cognitive decisions. And so the way I look at it is that performance objectives basically are critical when your emphasis is on training. Cognitive objectives are important when your emphasis is on education.
I see.
And in your field, they should go together. That almost all of your courses or experiences should have components of both of those. There should be some performance emphasis, but not at the expense of cognitive loss.
Correct. All right. Good question there, Rachel. Thank you. It's a great point you bring up there because obviously, there should be a mix of things because learning is not just, I think the one thing that people may forget is that, that performance that you're looking for is a combination of different elements that need to be addressed, not just one thing or another. But what I've seen so far, what I've seen so far in most learning and development or training and development is rooted in very academic practices, and is because there's a quiz involved. Then the first thing that people go to is Bloom's. So and you discussed before, we talked about Maggers and his take on the performance side, which I believe you said it was a misinterpretation of Bloom's in a way.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good. So any more questions, guys? Please join the chat. Just type in the chat your question and let us know. I'll give you another few seconds here to have a question come through. Otherwise, we have some other questions that we'll field out to Lorin, so he can clear us on that. All right, good. So it looks like, and I'll wait for another question here, but in essence, what we're saying, I wanted to ask you about anybody that's looking to do learning objectives and, address the cognitive as well, the behavioral side of things. They should be looking at this document, or at least, look at your book. Now, it's important because I think one of the main things that a lot of people may miss is the knowledge dimension, right? So the cognitive process dimension and how they're different and how they're important too, right?
Right, absolutely. If you look at most statements of objectives, they follow the same grammatical structure. It's subject, verb, object. Okay, so the student will be able to balance a checkbook. Okay, the student is the subject, able to balance is the verb, and a checkbook is the object, subject, verb, object.
I see.
The cognitive process dimension only handles the verb. And so you need some way of dealing with the object, which is the content or the subject matter. And the reason that the original group stopped short of putting these things out was that the object is subject specific, so that the content of mathematics and the content of mechanical engineering or the content of marketing, they're all different. And so they just said that's too complex, and they stopped. Between 1956 and 1990, a lot of work was done in what's called cognitive psychology or cognitive science, and they came up with knowledge categories that transcend subject matter. And the four that you see are the four that we talked about. There's factual knowledge, which is basically knowing the basics, the terminology, the facts. State capitals are factual knowledge. Presidents of the United States are factual knowledge. Then there's conceptual knowledge, which is knowledge of categories. So, for example, so-and-so is the president of Uganda is factual knowledge. But understanding what the president of Uganda does, okay, what does it mean to be the president of Uganda? That's conceptual knowledge. Procedural knowledge is a lot of the performance stuff that we were talking about. It's knowledge of how to do things.
So if you put it in terms, just to help you out here, and the audience that we have mostly is workplace learning folks. So right. Knowledge will be sort of what we talk about, like a customer service representative knowing how to issue a refund, right?
That's right. That's right. And metacognitive knowledge is basically knowledge of overall strategies, and knowing yourself is metacognitive knowledge. How do I come across to other people? If you're talking about that, a situation where you are in charge of a complaint department in business, okay, you can say, well, what are the facts? Okay, a lot of the facts come from the business you're working in. What are the conceptual knowledge? In other words, what are the principles I have to follow? The principles might be, the customer's always right. Okay, and then you're going to have to operate within that. Procedural knowledge may be knowledge of how to calm down a disgruntled complainer.
Right.
Metacognitive knowledge is what strategies for dealing with these people work for me, because not all strategies work for everybody. You can go to complaint departments in the same, or you can do that, post office people. You can go to the same post office, and you can have some people that are really good with people and some people that just want to get you the heck out of there. Okay? And metacognitive knowledge really should be, let me give you one more example. Although this isn't work, I guess it is workplace related. Priests and ministers. Okay? There are some priests that should be parish priests. There are some that shouldn't, because they're not very good with people. They might know what the Bible's about. They might have particular things, but they have no empathy. Okay, so metacognitive knowledge is really important as knowledge, because it helps people make decisions about really what should I do, where should I work, where am I going to be happy. So factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive knowledge are four different types of knowledge that you can cross with any of these cognitive process dimensions.
Okay, great. So you mentioned, and so we talked about metacognitive knowledge being more of a, what do I know of what I know, right? So if I'm a customer service representative, how good am I at what I do? And, I guess a lot of that is also very depending on experience, right?
I think so. I think it's one of those objectives that take a long time to develop. That I'm 74 and my metacognitive knowledge level is much higher than when I had my doctorate at 28. And it comes over time with experience. To me, metacognitive knowledge really helps you differentiate knowledge from wisdom. That what experience and age gives you is not more knowledge necessarily, but a different way of looking at that knowledge or using that knowledge more appropriately. And that's what I think wisdom is. The other thing about metacognitive knowledge, there's a lot of stuff right now about executive functions in the cognitive psychology group. In other words, if you're working with people from a metacognitive knowledge perspective, is one of the things you should be teaching them is how to regulate their own learning, how to know when they're doing the right thing, how to make adjustments along the way, instead of just doing the same thing because that's the way we do things around here. To have enough common sense to stop and say, I know that's the way we're supposed to be doing, but with this particular client, this isn't working, and I need to make an adjustment. That kind of reading, and I work a lot with teachers, and there are teachers who are much better at reading their students. They know when the students are confused. They know when students are frustrated, and they can stop what they're doing and make adjustments to reach the student. There are others that just run through it. They have their lesson plan, and they go from page 1 to page 2 to page 3 to page 4. And metacognitive knowledge gives you that, what we call executive functioning and self-regulation. And that would be very important. I mean, let's go back to my tennis playing example. If you're playing against somebody and all of the things you're trying don't work, either you're going to lose or you need to adjust, okay? And the adjustment has to come out of who is this person? How has he played before? What do I have to do different in the next set to make it work? This is true of all situations. I mean, if you're talking about, my father was a welder, okay, and he was up in northern Minnesota, and it was 30 degrees below zero, and a truck broke down in the iron mines. Okay, so what do you do? Okay, is it going to work out there? Do I bring the same things out there? Does a acetylene torch work when it's 30 degrees below zero? Do I have to wait until it gets warmer? What are my strategies that I can use based on the experience that I've had?
Good stuff. All right, guys. So listen, we'll get another 15 minutes. If you would please give us any questions. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. We'll feel welcome to take this great opportunity to have this one-on-one with Lorin Anderson. I will go ahead and ask you another question, Lorin, that came around those things. So one of the main things, and let me go ahead and share again to discuss a little more about the experience that some people may have when they go to things. You're able to see the pyramid here?
Yeah, I don't like that one either. But
I know. That's why we're talking. So one of the main things is that, in Vanderbilt is probably one of the put out the most stuff out there with blown stuff on it. But in terms of the way I always looked at this, for me, I don't know, and this is just me, and this is just my observations and things. It seems to me that you can't really achieve learning because some people, so obviously, two ideas out there that I heard. One is that, you're not supposed to look at this as a pyramid, that, you will create your learning objectives depending on the specific learning level you want to achieve and things like that. But for me, it seems like there's some kind of scaffold going where you have to meet the first three requirements. So you have to meet the ability to remember, to understand, and apply for you to be able to get past and go, to that higher level of learning. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think there's a good division between apply and analyze. What I try to do to make things simpler is basically use remember as a first level, understand and apply combined as a second level, because of this notion of the difference between cognitive objectives and performance objectives, right? Because performance objectives are more apply, cognitive objectives are more understand. So I kind of tell them you could put those two together. And then you have analyze, evaluate, and create, which are kind of called higher order cognitive processes. If that simplifies things for people, that's great, because they're actually still thinking about a system that basically moves in terms of developmental complexity. Now, the question becomes, are they linear? That is to say, do you have to understand before you apply? Do you have to apply before you analyze? Or do they work in concert? And so if you're applying something, you have some type of an algorithm that you're applying. Do you just do it without thinking, or do you stop periodically and evaluate where you are? And
that's a good conversation, yeah.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then you are really coupling apply and evaluate. So it's not hierarchical in a sense of what you do first or second. It's how you put the pieces together. I talk about these 6 really as tools in a toolbox, that use them wisely. Okay, everybody knows that sometimes the best way to understand something is try to apply it. Okay, and if you really understand something, it will work. And if you don't, you're going to mess up. And then you have to get a different understanding of what the system is, or what the circumstances are, or why didn't that strategy work with this client or customer? And what modifications do I need to make?
Right.
The other thing about remember is you don't have to remember everything. Okay, I have 2 rules for remembering objectives. The first rule is remember things you have to use over and over again. Okay, so if you have to fill out a time card every day, remember how to do it. You know, you don't want to sit down and have to rethink every time, because it's going to take you forever to get it done. Second one is remember it if it's easier to remember than it is to look it up. In today's world, there's so much that you have access to online that to carry all this stuff around in your head doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
And
but
if you sit down and say, those are the 2 basic reasons to remember, that you used it over and over and over again, or it's easier to remember it than to look it up. For example, your phone number. Okay, it's easier to remember than to look it up all the time.
And probably not anymore. But
well, that's probably true. You know, and certainly you don't have to remember. I have 2 adult sons. I don't remember their phone numbers because they're in my address.
Well, you do have to remember where they're at.
That's all. Well, sometimes I don't even know that, but yeah, that would be helpful. So I see it as these are 6 interrelated categories of processes. You need to understand the sub-processes to make them a little more concrete, measurable, but consider these more as tools in a toolbox than a rigid linear sequence from remember to understand to apply and so forth and so on.
Okay. Now, in the sense of, because, many of the folks that are here, what they encounter is they have to provide someone the abilities or, transfer knowledge and skills so they can perform something, so they can do something, right? And usually what that lands into will be the apply level, meaning, can we actually observe someone doing the job the way it's supposed to be done? So customer service representative, they have to know where the resources are, or remember, right, where the resources are to do a refund. They have to understand the context of when they will give a refund or when or not or whatnot, or where to look that process so they can follow it. They have to then perform the action of doing the refund, which would probably be in some kind of electronic system, right?
Right.
And then analyze the conditions by which that was done and whether it was done correctly or not, and evaluate then their performance based on whatever the standard for the company is. And on top of that, I think at the end of all of that, the ultimate employee that you have being in that task, in that context, being the customer service representative, is the one that perhaps can look at the whole process. And because of their level of expertise and level of knowledge at that point, they're able to create a new policy out of it, or a new process that improves the existing one. What do you think about that? Is that
no, I think that makes sense. That makes sense. The only thing you have to be concerned about is the nature of the workplace itself. That create is not necessarily valued in all workplaces.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Like do it the way we want to do it. Don't
exactly right. So now we're back to understand. Okay, that do you understand the constraints within which you are working, and what you get rewarded for, what you are reprimanded for, right? And if create is something that people value, as they do to a certain extent in Silicon Valley, but not completely, okay? And if you do create something in Silicon Valley, make sure that the person at the top of the organization gets the credit, right? That's part of the entire culture of Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
Right? All of these things are possible. The issue becomes what's valued in that organization, what's valued in that business.
So, Lorin, we got about 9 minutes left. A great question came through, and I need to ask you this. So Rachel's asking again, so how did the intended purpose of the taxonomy become so misunderstood and thereby misapplied for decades by numerous education and corporate professionals? That's a great question. I got a lot of thoughts behind that, but I'll let him answer it.
Yeah, that would require more than 9 minutes. I'll tell you what I think the problem in education in general is, and the taxonomy is one example of this problem, and that is people don't read deeply. Okay, educators tend not to they get most of their ideas secondhand, just like the pyramid you showed. Okay, people who look at the pyramid don't necessarily have ever picked up the book or have ever even picked up the PDF file. Okay, and so what you get is you look at that and it becomes truth. And then that gets spread on. It's like that old game of telephone where you whisper something to one person who whispers, then you realize at the end that what the person's saying has nothing to do with what you were sending. And over time, I think that happens to a lot of ideas in education, all kinds of education. You know, if that weren't a problem in teaching reading, we'd teach reading a lot better. But we don't. I mean, that's it. So I think what happened is everybody people, I used to ask people about the original taxonomy, what color is the cover of the original taxonomy? See, I didn't ask them if they read it. I just said, what color is it? And they didn't know. And I said, okay, so you haven't read it. And they said, well, of course not. All I remember is knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Okay, if that's all you remember and you haven't engaged in a discussion or done this kind of reading or whatever, the next time you pass it on to somebody else, okay, it's going to be your own interpretation and translation, which as it goes through, gets more and more misused and misunderstood.
I completely agree with that. I think that was a great answer. Here we get a question from Rosa. One of the last questions is, what advice do you have for people new and old in the field, in the workplace learning and development field, so that they are successful applying the principles?
Well, I think don't buy the book.
Don't Google search.
don't Google search. You mentioned the PDF, which is the theory into practice. That's the first thing I would do is download and print out that, because it's a journal, special issue of a journal. It's not long. It goes into some of the more difficult aspects of what we're talking about. It has a wonderful overview in the first chapter, which gives you a lot of things, but then it also gets into cognitive processes, it gets into metacognitive knowledge, it gets into assessment, it gets into teaching. It's divided that way where you can see the application as you go through the chapters. And it's readable because it's a journal.
Yes.
The book's too, it's too much. The book is something you'd use for a series of seminars on the subject over time. Okay.
Yeah.
But the PDF file from theory into practice, that's where I would start.
That's great. Yeah, I will also say that in terms of searches, guys, when you go search for things, if you hear something secondhand, which is basically what he was alluding to, that's how we ended up with learning styles. That's how we ended up with Addy as a model. That's how we ended up with things that don't make any sense like that. Addy's not a model, and learning styles are fake, and the same thing with Bloom's taxonomy. So go to Google Scholar. That's probably one of the best searches you can find.
Right.
So Google Scholar, because that is addressing only academic sources.
Right.
So quick question related to this and not somewhat related. I see we have, I think part two of the question would be awesome. A part two discussion. Oh, okay. Becky's asking for a part two discussion with you. Well, you're a busy guy. We'll see if that happens. So, as always, you and I can talk for hours on this, and I really appreciate you joining us and doing this. Guys, any last questions before we go? We only got about a few minutes, about 3 or 4 minutes. If no questions, please use the chat and let Dr. Anderson know how, you appreciated this, just like Becky did. One quick question, there's a lot of emphasis today, Lorin, about learning by doing,
Yes.
and sort of putting, it almost seems like it puts less value on the cognitive side. It's all like learning by doing. And I can understand why that comes around, because a lot of people, what they're doing is just doing classroom stuff, and they're just doing information dumps. So I think, you need both, and you need a balance. I think learning by doing is very dangerous.
By itself. I think that's the message, Alex, that to develop a really strong program, you need balance. Just as I was saying about performance and cognitive objectives, you don't have to choose one and denigrate the other. Learning by doing has a place, but like there are science kits out there that are being used, but nobody's learning anything because all they have to do is go through the science kit and write up the report. Okay, and if you turn in the report, you get a grade. But if you sit down and say to the child, what did you learn from this? How many times have we been in situations like that where we have workshops and we attend a workshop and we get a little star for attending a workshop relative to our job, and you say, what have you learned from it? I don't know. I mean, and I think it's how to balance that out. When you're engaged in a learning by doing kind of a situation, that's where metacognitive knowledge really enters the picture. What am I learning here? What am I supposed to learn here? Okay, how does what I'm learning fit into my perspective on life? Okay, how is that going to make me a better worker, a better person? Okay, right. But that kind of a balance and moderation is basically, it's the same thing with objectives. You can't have a billion objectives, okay, because you only have a limited amount of time.
Right.
Okay, so you have to be selective, and that's another attempt to balance. So yeah, everything almost everything. There's some things that are wrong, as you said. There's absolutely no evidence on learning styles. Get rid of that.
Right.
But among all the other things, you have to sit down and say they all probably have the good things, have some value. Okay. And if they have value, the issue then becomes when to do what and how to fit the pieces together in an organized and balanced and effective fashion.
Perfect. That's no better message there than, I think that's actually a message for life. You have to have balance and everything. So. Yeah. Well, again, Dr. Lorin Anderson, sir, I wish you the best outcome on this hurricane situation. And please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you out. If anything happens in any event, I would like to thank you on behalf of the chapter for joining us and having this conversation with us. Everybody here pretty much has commented and said that, they really loved the session with you. And it was everything I hoped that it would be. I would like to thank you again. Thank you guys for being here. I'm Alex Salas, president of the chapter. And Once again, this was Dr. Lorin Anderson, and we had this great discussion today about learning adjectives. We'll see you on the next one, guys. Next Tuesday, there's another webinar with Carol Cohen on personalization tips for onboarding. But for today, this is all. Thank you, Lorin. Thank you, everybody else.
Thanks, Alex.
Have a great weekend.
All right.